In today's video, I'm going to be building a gaming PC for $600 that you can actually put together right now in 2021. This might be the ultimate anti-scalper gaming PC build, and it even features a dedicated graphics card, but more on that a little bit later. In today's video, I'm going to cover off all the components I chose and why, put the system together from start through to finish, and then test out the performance. And spoiler alert, some of the results might surprise you. 70 frames per second in GTA 5, anyone? More than 255 in Valorant, more than 120 in Overwatch, and over 60 in Fortnite. We'll take a closer look at those numbers a little bit later. This build is a bit of a pocket rocket, so let's do this. As always, we're going to kick things off by installing as many of our components into the motherboard today as possible. Doing this early on makes the whole build that little bit easier to work with. This is Gigabyte's B450M S2H. They also do the DS3H and various other pretty similar versions of this motherboard. Essentially, you want a great budget B450 option, and Gigabyte do that better than most people on the market. We're going to be coupling this with our AMD CPU choice. Now, in an ideal world, I would have gone for a Ryzen 3 3100 or a 3300X, but you just can't buy them at the moment. Instead, the Ryzen 5 1600 from a couple of generations ago is going to work great. You still get all the same features that we know and love from Ryzen, with good upgrade paths, and it's a more powerful Ryzen 5 chip. We're going to install it into the motherboard, which is super simple with AMD chips, as there's no force required. You simply just slot the CPU in, push the arm down, and you're good to go. One of the major advantages, of course, of a Ryzen CPU is the great included stock cooler. That's right, this comes included for free, so you haven't got to go out and spend $20 or $30 on an aftermarket unit, and as you'll see from the temperature testing later on, it does the job well. Normally, this will come with pre-applied thermal paste, so no worry, you don't have to apply your own, but if you've used it before, wipe it clean and put a fresh dab on just to be on the safe side. Go ahead and tighten the cooler down in a cross pattern, kind of diagonally, corner by corner, so you don't put too much strain on the processor. Once you've gone ahead and done that, we can move on to the next component, which is of course our RAM or our memory. Now for this build, you want to go for either 8 or for 16 gigabytes. Now, from our testing, 8 gigabytes is going to be enough with our other hardware combinations, but if you'd like to future-proof this build, so all you've got to do later on is upgrade the graphics card to say a 3060, then go for 16 gigabytes of RAM. As I say, in its current state, 8 is enough, but if you're looking for a bit of future-proofing, 16 is where I would go. This XPG D20 kit will do the job really quite nicely. There's also some great budget options out there from Corsair, and I'll link all the components and alternative choices in the description below and in the card section now. So go and check those out for latest pricing and availability. Talking of which, the storage is the next component today, and this is another area in a build that's been plagued by pricing and availability issues. Now, I've gone for Samsung's 980 SSD drive, not the 980 Pro, just the bog standard budget 980. If you'd like to save a little bit of money, then a SATA SSD, like the Kingston A400 or SanDisk SSD Plus, are awesome choices. But as I say, an M.2 drive is going to be a better option if you're looking to future-proof your build. Not only that, it will just make the system run that much quicker. From boot up times to game load times, it just makes the whole thing a much more enjoyable experience. We're going to install it onto the one M.2 slot that this motherboard provides, really conveniently just below the CPU. And for this, you will of course need a teeny tiny little screwdriver, because a big Phillips head is not going to work. That brings all the work that we need to do on the motherboard assembly to a close. We've got the CPU cooler and the processor installed. We have, of course, got the RAM or the memory installed, our M.2 SSD, and all we really need to do now is move it over into the case choice, give it some power, and install the graphics card, which is the bit you're all very interested in, I'm sure. Now, picking a case for a budget build's quite tricky. We did a video earlier in the year covering our top 5 cases, so that's worth a watch if you're a bit unsure what you're looking for. Some of my favourite choices include the Cooler Master MB320Al and loads of options out there from AeroCool, but more recently we've got our hands on with this. This is a chassis from a brand here in the UK called Neutron Lab. I'll link the latest pricing and availability, as I say, down below. Now, you'll be able to find some pretty comparable options globally for this case, but here in the UK this is available exclusively at Ebuyer, and as I say, we'll put those links down below. And it's basically got all of the features you should look for in a good budget case. mesh at the front for good airflow, a bit of RGB, you've got a solid I/O with power, reset, USB 2 and USB 3. The build quality feels really quite nice actually, and a full tempered glass side panel allows us to show off our build today quite nicely. Although this is a full ATX form factor, technically it is quite compact, so don't worry about that with our micro ATX motherboard. I would say that a slightly larger case, but don't go too big, does make the build easier, especially for a first time builder. So that's definitely something that you guys at home should consider. I give this advice out in pretty much every build, but take off both of the side panels straight away, regardless of how you intend to put the system together. It just makes the case that much easier to access and makes the build process a little bit more simple. Just before you install the motherboard, don't forget to put in the rear I/O shield. You want to do this with the kind of knobbly border facing outwards and the audio ports at the bottom of the case. That will make sliding the motherboard in a second that little bit easier. Once you've got this in, you can go ahead and slide the motherboard in, screw it down corner by corner, and we're good to go. Now, picking a power supply for a budget build can actually be quite a tricky choice. At the higher end of the market, you've got fancy modular 80 plus gold options, which are going to be pretty reliable. But at the cheaper end of the market, there are some units you should just avoid. This Cooler Master MWE 500 is a really basic 500 watt power supply, but for a build of this spec, it's going to be absolutely fine. If you wanted to go for, say, an 80 plus gold certified 650 watt unit, you're probably going to be paying over double what you are for this one. So future proofing is a bit of a different question here. Even so, it's still got GPU power connectors, specifically a pair of 6+2 pins, so great for upgrading to say an RTX 2060 a little later down the line, but don't go too silly without upgrading the power supply, as you could cause yourself a few problems. Installing the power supply is pretty easy. We have got a few more cables we've got to kind of hide away, with this being a non-modular unit, but I'm sure we'll get through it. The only power connectors you guys really need to worry about is the largest of the bunch, the 24-pin motherboard power cable, which goes to the right-hand side of the motherboard, just like so. We're also going to install the 4+4-pin CPU power connector. That is this one, and this goes to the top left of this Gigabyte B450 motherboard. And then the case just needs a SATA power connector at the bottom for the RGB hub to make sure that all works a little bit later on. And that's basically all the power cables for this system done, which means we can finally move on to the graphics card. Now, James, you said this build was in stock, available, and ready to buy in 2021. What graphics card could you possibly have used? Here it is. Now, I know some of you are thinking, James, you have truly lost your mind, but let me show you why you're wrong with raw performance and gaming benchmarks. On your screen now is a few of the biggest titles out there that we tested out on this system with the GT 1030, the card that might be just about the only one you can buy in 2021. You can actually pick these up from Newegg for about $150 super easily in the States and in various retailers in other regions. We were really impressed with the performance of this card and had written it off ourselves to begin with. Some of you might have wondered why we haven't gone and picked up, say, a second-hand Dell Optiplex and just slotted this in. That's because we wanted to give the GT 1030 the best possible chance at performance by not constraining it with a 5 or 6 or even 7-year-old CPU. Plus, this build gives you a really nice base from which you can upgrade. As I say though, let's take a deeper look into performance right now and see why this card is really worth considering. GTA 5 was the first game we tested out, and at 1080p kind of normal medium settings with anti-aliasing tuned down and VSync of course disabled, we got an average of 80 frames per second, tested in the game's inbuilt benchmarking mode, with 74 and 62 for the 90 and 99th percentile results, meaning this system stayed well above the 60 FPS mark at pretty much all times. Apex Legends is the next title today, and this is a more demanding game, believe it or not, than GTA 5. We got just under 60 frames per second on average, with 90 and 99th percentile results in the region of 47 and 40, but this was at 1080p, so if you wanted to tune down even further, scale that resolution back a little bit, you can do. But nearly 60 FPS on a budget system in 2021 is not bad. Valorant though, thankfully, gives you a little bit more frame rate. And when I say a little bit more, I mean a lot more. At 1080p kind of normal medium settings, we got 225 frames per second on average, and never really dropped below the 130 mark, measured as always with NVIDIA FrameView and MSI's Afterburner, while Fortnite at 1080p competitive settings yielded us around 64 frames a second. You'll be glad to hear though that the 99th percentile result was only 11 FPS behind, meaning the game stayed above 60 FPS 90% of the time. time. Overwatch then is next up, and here we got 122 frames per second at 1080p. Once again, we did tune the settings down just a little bit, but still some very respectable results. While CSGO, which is next on the list, yielded 121 frames per second at 1080p. The final game we tested on our humble GT 1030 was Rainbow Six Siege, and in the game's inbuilt benchmarking mode at 1080p low to medium settings, we got 63 FPS on average. Genuinely not a bad result for a system that's super easy to upgrade later when GPU prices get back to normal, but lets you game at 1080p, 60 FPS or above in some of the biggest titles out right now. It is absolutely hilarious looking at this card compared to like an RTX 3070. We'll put a couple side by side on your screen. I mean, it is absolutely ludicrous, but when we started benchmarking this, when Harry got some of the big titles out and I had a look, I just couldn't believe my eyes. Of course, it's not ideal. Of course, I'd much rather be gaming on, say, you know, a 3060. But for a build that comes in at $600 US, you're actually not losing that much performance over, say, an RX 5500 XT build, which is what we would have put together a year ago today, when stock and availability was a little bit more normal. With that being said, these cards are still pretty popular, so while you will find GT 1030s brand new in stock for reasonable prices, you might not be able to find this ASUS card specifically, which is fine. A Zotac, a Palette, an ASUS, a Gigabyte, an MSI card, they're all going to be absolutely fine, and with 2 gigabytes of video memory, it's actually a pretty capable GPU at 1080p. Let's go ahead and install it in the case to see how, you know, how much it fills the case up. I'm joking. It's not going to fill the case up, but hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea as to what can actually be achieved in 2021 on a budget. So much so, it hasn't even got 2 slots wide. It's a single slot GPU. That's just mental. And with that, the GPU is installed and the build is basically done. I am deadly serious though, in that I say you should consider the GT 1030 as a good stopgap. If you buy a second-hand 2060, you'll pay like $800 for it and you will never get that money back. A GT 1030, it's not really going to cost you anything in the grand scheme of things. Let's round off today's video though, as always, with a bit of a montage so you can see this build in action, check out the aesthetics of the Neutron Lab case, as well as of course our tiny GTX. It's a GT. It's just, there's no X, it's just a GT 1030. Roll that montage though. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one. Adios.